Hi everyone and welcome back to the 1000 Recordings to Hear Before You Die, our vlog series looking through Tom Moon's amazing book of 1000 recordings he recommends to hear before you die. And last week we had a wonderful musical journey into the world of blues with Taj Mahal, into the world of punk with the Sex Pistols, and into the world of jazz with Charlie Parker. I have to say I loved all three of those albums, so I'm super excited to get into today's episode where we will be going into the genre undefined world of art pop. We will be going back into the world of blues, albeit a little bit differently to last time, and then finally into the world of rock slash pop with a legendary artist. So without further ado, let's get cracking, and we're going to open today with Beck. I'm really looking forward to this one because Beck is an artist that I don't know terrifically well. I know a few tunes here and there, and I know that he was active in the soundtrack for Scott Pilgrim versus the World, which I absolutely loved. But here are a few little stats about Beck. So has been active since 1985 and remains active to this day. A total of 14 studio albums, which is pretty damn good, and 4 Grammy wins. Beck is a writer, a musician, a vocalist. He plays the guitar and the keyboards, has a very unique voice, but is primarily known for being really experimental and blending genres, which is why when I was putting this episode together, I didn't know how to classify Beck. People often say art pop, but when you listen to him, it's a real mashup of a whole load of different things. So I think we'll get into that in the analysis. Today we're going to be looking at an album called Mutations, and without further ado, let's have a little look at the statistics for that album. So Mutations was released in November 1998. It has a running time of 49 minutes and 17 seconds, and we have an indication that it was fairly good because it did win a Grammy that year for Best Alternative Album, and this made me even more excited to dig into it. So without further ado, let's give it a listen and let's get some opinion and see, is it one of the 1000 greatest recordings of all time? We've had a listen to Mutations by Beck, and it's a really good album. It's really cool. And I think part of the reason it resonates so much with me is that as a musician, I'm quite experimental. I tend to move between genres and styles, even within albums like Beck does. And I like to use weird sounds on weird instruments. And yeah, it just really chimed with me, this album. It's a lovely listen from start to finish. It's great. It keeps you on your toes, even though it's got a gentle style nearly all the way through. And there are elements of pop and rock and definitely some blues in there as well. It's a wonderful record, and I would strongly recommend giving it a listen. Beck's voice is really lovely. The guitar playing is simple but really clean and really nice to listen to, and there are occasionally weird other instruments thrown into the mix, which kind of makes it even more fun. In terms of my favourite songs on the album, the first is Bottle of Blues, which is a really lovely blues slash pop crossover track, which is not something you hear that often, but it definitely is. And then the second one I'm going to go for, it would have been really easy to go with the opening track, which I also believe is one of the singles off the album, but in keeping with my slightly odder tastes in music, I'm going to go with Diamond Bollocks, which is the last track on the album, and is this really long, really windy, really crazy musical experiment, which it's just awesome. It's really different. It's really out there, and this album won a Grammy for Best Alternative Album. And I think nowadays when we say alternative, we almost mean hard rock, heavy music. You know, that's what alternatives become. It's metal and it's loud, and Beck is not any of those things, but is definitely alternative in the way that he doesn't define himself inside a genre and just, I think, plays what he wants to play. And yeah, so Diamond Bollocks is my second choice of the album. And now let's find out what the expert thought of it. So expert opinion on Mutations by Beck, and not a million miles from my own, but with a bit more knowledge of the artist and the time. So I think the primary reason this album is in this list is because it's one of the most influential, he calls it a pop album, of the 90s, but then, as I said before, goes on to point out that it's a pop album that's infused with other genres like blues and others, and it just makes it completely different to everything else. And the other comment he had here is that compared to a lot of other Beck's work, maybe it's more controlled. So the songs have more structure and they're less chaotic and they're less out there than some of the other albums, and that actually makes this album work and potentially why it got the critical acclaim that it did. He highlights, the use of steel-strung guitar and all these other weird and wacky instruments that Beck threw in that I loved, and I have to say I agree entirely with the author on this one. He did choose one of the tracks I went for as his favourite tracks, which was Bottle of Blues. He also went for Cold Brains, which is the opener, which would have been my third choice, and then a few others which I'll just read out to you now. Nobody's Fault But My Own, We Live Again, and Tropicalia. And, here's another example. Tropicalia is almost a samba tune. So, Beck, great artist, really out there, really good fun, and I would thoroughly recommend giving this album a listen whenever you like. It's a really easy listen. It's really, really fun. It's really playful, and it's just really enjoyable from start to finish. And now we have done album number 4. We're going to move on to album number 5, and we're going to take a journey in our musical time machine all the way back to the 1930s to jam out with the Mississippi Sheiks. Welcome to the 1930s, and we're going to the South and the world of the Mississippi Sheiks. So they are a country blues act that played in the 1930s, and they primarily use guitar and fiddle. So very, very different to the blues we heard from Taj Mahal last week, which was much more modern and had influences of soul and rock in there. Neither genre was anywhere near coming onto the scene at this point. In total, the Mississippi Sheiks recorded approximately 70 tracks, and they were inducted into the Mississippi Musicians Hall of Fame back in 2004. The best fact that I learnt about them was that their track City on Top of the World was both inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame, but has also been preserved as a piece of cultural heritage by the Library of Congress as well. So obviously a pretty important track culturally in US music. And the album we're going to be listening to today is essentially a best of the Mississippi Sheiks, because as far as I can tell, there aren't really other albums by the Mississippi Sheiks. But if anyone knows differently, please let me know. So without further ado, let's have a look at this album. This record is called Honey Baby, Don't Let the Deal Go Down, and it is essentially a best of compilation of the Mississippi Sheiks, because as I just said, I'm not sure they actually have other albums, pure albums, to actually judge things off. It was released back in 1992, the version I listened to anyway, and it is 20 songs long with a running time of 64 minutes, and that's really all there is to say about it. So we'll have a listen and see what we think. Right, we've had a listen to Honey Babe, Don't Let the Deal Go Down, and this is where we get into an interesting thing about music, and that is I have a firm opinion there is no such thing as good music and bad music. There is just music that you personally like that's to your taste, and music that you don't like so much is not to your taste. And unfortunately, this one, the Mississippi Sheiks, is not really my thing on the whole, to be honest. It's quite long, and all the songs to my ear are fairly similar. They're these very, very old-fashioned folk blues tunes with guitar and fiddle, and yeah, just didn't really resonate with me overall. I listened to it cover to cover, and there were some good tracks, but they tended to blend in together. And I think for me, if this was to be a recording to hear before I die, it would be there to teach me maybe about the roots of music that I do love. So people that had paved the way for artists like Taj Mahal and others in the blues movement after the Mississippi Sheiks. So I'm not knocking them. I'm sure there's people that love their music, and just not for me, this one. I have still chosen a couple of the tracks I think are worth a listen, and one of them is the fairly obvious one. I'm going to have to look at the playlist just to get them. I do apologise. So we're going to go for Sitting on Top of the World, which is the song which is in the Library of Congress for posterity. And another one I liked was called I've Got Blood in My Eyes for You, just because it had these oddly visceral lyrics for what I think was supposed to be a ballad. And that's one thing I will give them. Some of their lyrics are quite good, and I think quite edgy for the 1930s. So it's not a bad album, just not to my taste. Now let's see what our expert made of the Mississippi Sheiks. And reading through the analysis, it would appear that the Mississippi Sheiks were from a family of legendary bluesmen. So they were very prolific in the 1920s and 1930s. And the Mississippi Sheiks were just the most famous combination of this family of musicians. And in terms of why this recording is in here, I think the author, Mr. Moon, genuinely likes the music of the Mississippi Sheiks, and he says they've got beautiful haunting vocals and really nice string melodies, obviously not echoed by me in this particular case, but just shows you different people for different music, horses for courses, as we'd say in the UK. I think a primary reason this album is in here, reading through the analysis, is that the Mississippi Sheiks and this family of musicians really paved the way for other blues musicians in the future. They were pioneers, and they really brought grassroots blues to the South and took it to a whole new level. So in the 1930s, this music would have been really progressive, and it would have been really out there and different and rebellious, and it doesn't sound it now, but it would have been then. In terms of the tracks to choose off the album, he's gone with the same one as me to start with, which is City on Top of the World, and then also Stop and Listen Blues number 2. So there's Mr. Moon's recommendations. Feel free to give those a listen over mine as always, because he knows better than I do. And now I'm super excited because for album number 6 of 1000, we are going to be listening to the work of a legend and someone I grew up listening to, the amazing, the incredible, taken way before his time, tragically, John Lennon. So here we have a real treat. Our first, I think, contemporary rock and roll music legend, John Lennon, who, well, let's have a look at John. So obviously, originally and famously a member of the Beatles and one half of Lennon and McCartney, writing incredible music for actually quite a short duration of time compared to some of these musicians we will talk about who have careers that span 40, 50, sometimes 60 years. So John Lennon was active as part of the Beatles and as a solo act from 1956 to 1980, when obviously he was tragically assassinated in what has to be one of the most mindless criminal acts I've certainly ever seen. He went solo in 1968 after the breakup of the Beatles and wrote primarily with Yoko Ono in that period. Over his career, John Lennon would have 25 number one singles between the Beatles and his solo work. He won a Grammy Award for one of his solo albums, Double Fantasy, and was very justifiably entered into the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 1987. He also is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame not once, but twice as a member of the Beatles and for his solo work. And I think we can all say for John Lennon, it's thoroughly deserved. I'm a huge fan. And I'm really thrilled today that we get to listen to Imagine. And everyone knows the song Imagine, but personally, I don't think I've ever actually listened to the album in full. So let's have a quick look at Imagine. So Imagine, obviously famous for its eponymous title track, Imagine, was released in September of 1971 with a nice gentle running time of 39 minutes and 29 seconds. The other fun little fact I wanted to bring up for this album was it was produced by John Lennon, Yoko Ono, and also Phil Spector, who obviously maybe a slightly controversial name nowadays, but was a huge producer back in the day. And let's see, did it lead to a great record as well as a great song? Right, we've had a listen to Imagine by John Lennon, and as I could have guessed, it's a wonderful album. It in a lot of ways it does sound like a Beatles record. You know, there is a John Lennon style. All musicians have styles, and John Lennon has one as much as anyone else. So it's like listening to a Beatles record in some aspects, and in some aspects it's not. I think the key thing really is that Imagine as a record is definitely an ode to pacifism and to fighting war and to celebrating peace, and that really comes through. And some of the Beatles stuff did that as well, but I think it's much more prominent on this album than on Beatles albums. John Lennon plays wonderful guitar, and he does some really cool things with the slide, which I don't think he really did in the Beatles. There's definitely some little tweaks and differences between how he plays in the Beatles and how he plays as a solo artist, and I think that's really cool. I think when artists go solo, they have to have a slightly different sound and a different take on things, and maybe they get to express themselves creatively in different ways that wouldn't have worked as part of their original band. So overall, I loved Imagine. It was a great record, definitely worthy of being in the 1,000 recordings to hear before you die. It's a really nice listen, and the two tracks I'm going to pick, I have to pick Imagine, because Imagine is just this hauntingly brilliant piece of music. It is gorgeous. It's both uplifting and incredibly sad at the same time, and you know, I could probably do a whole vlog talking about Imagine as a song. And the other song I'm going to pick off this album is called I Don't Want to Be a Soldier Mama, because it has a bit more of a rock and roll bluesy feel. It's maybe more to my taste. You know, it's one of the ones I really loved off the album, and let's see how I do compared to Mr. Moon. Reading through Tom Moon's analysis of this album is really interesting. He starts off basically by saying that by the time he released Imagine, as part of the Beatles and the Yoko Ono band and various other bits and pieces, John Lennon had achieved pretty much everything he wanted to do musically, and he'd got into a really heavy rock and roll sphere. He'd done loads of really experimental stuff, and Imagine was almost him coming back to his roots, stripping things back to basics and producing just what he calls his most complete solo work. And having not listened to the other solo works in great detail, I'll take his word for it, because it is a very cohesive, very solid, very well structured album. But the other reason it appears to be in here is because it apparently is a very personal album, and it shows the different sides of John Lennon. So you do have this activist side, this disgruntled citizen that is raging against the government in songs like I Don't Want to Be a Soldier. But you've also got more personal songs like Jealous Guy, which are all to do with John Lennon as a human and his own flaws and his own struggles, and I think that's a part of the reason it's in there. I think the main reason it's in here is because of Imagine as a song, and because it is just the kind of song that can change your perspective, and it's a really special song. You know, it basically says you can achieve anything if you put your mind to it. And his final comment on this album is, you know, if you ever feel down, listen to the words of Imagine and just remember that you can do anything. You're not the only dreamer out there. So definitely worthy of being in the 1,000 recordings to hear before you die. I would recommend listening to it. It's a lovely listen. It's a great record. And that's our final album for today. Tuning into episode 2 of this vlog on 1,000 recordings to hear before you die. I hope you've enjoyed the analysis and the little fun facts about the acts we've had today. So obviously we've had the crazy alternative world of Beck. We've gone back to the 30s with the Mississippi Sheiks, and finally we got to have a lovely listen to a musical legend, a personal favourite of mine, Mr. John Lennon. And it's been a wonderful set of albums yet again. I would thoroughly recommend listening to the Beck and John Lennon albums, and if you are into that sort of old school blues, please do check out the Mississippi Sheiks. As I say, not my cup of tea, but you know, I know lots of people will love that groundbreaking blues that they produced back in the 30s. And if you are intrigued by our music as the Valkyries, please feel free to check out our blog on our band or our album, our first album, which is available on all good streaming services, with the links are in the description below. And next time we will be going through 3 more albums, and we will be jetting into some heavy metal and some jazz and some acoustic, so 3 areas that are very different once again. But until next time, thank you so much for watching. Please feel free to comment, ask questions. I'd love to discuss this music with people. It's one of my big passions, and I'm definitely getting a great education from it. But until next time, goodbye from me.